Anyway, I'm Jeff Goldberg from The Atlantic. Welcome everybody to this session. I think it's the most important session because I'm doing it. But it is actually the most urgent question, I think, facing dozens of American cities. What I want to do is very, very briefly tell you who each person is. You have their bios, so I don't have to go into it, and then we're going to jump right in. Andy Papachristos next to me, who is one of the world's great last names, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm trying to rhyme things with it. Associate Professor of Sociology at Yale, and is very well known in this field for using data to sort of reveal hidden truths about homicide. Jamira Burley, who is director of the Philadelphia Youth Commission. She's unconscionably young and has a very long resume already. It's a little bit frightening. David Chipman, senior vice president of ShotSpotter, former ATF. How many years in ATF?
25.
25 years in ATF, so brings obviously huge technical knowledge of this question. And then the mayor of Los Angeles, Mitch Landrieu.
Richard Reardon.
Yeah.
No.
Garcetti.
I'm teasing.
Yeah, I remember. That's Garcetti.
I know where I am.
Mitch, everybody knows, of course, trailblazing mayor of one of America's most promising and troubling cities. Is that fair?
Yeah.
That's a nice way of putting it, right? Mitch is, I don't have to tell you much about Mitch. You'll hear from him at length in a minute. What I wanted to do is I'm going to ask the three panelists in the middle just to give us a couple of minutes each. We do have some time here, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions. Give us a couple of minutes each on a very simple question, which is, what have they learned from data, from more sophisticated methods of collecting data about violent crime, homicide in particular, over the last decade or so? And then I'm going to ask His Honor to sort of refract what he's heard from them through the experience he has actually running a major American city that has a still significant homicide problem. Even though it's down, it's still, and we've had a lot of conversations about this actually, it's still unacceptably high to the mayor, unacceptably high from any perspective of what a civilization should be. So why don't we start? Let me just go right in order. You've done some work that actually is directly affected or directly been used by New Orleans to try to figure out their problem. But talk a little bit about what you've learned over the last several years about patterns of homicides, networks in particular, but capture for us what data has done for you in your understanding of this immense problem.
Sure. So you can't give a professor a microphone and not expect him to put a couple slides up. So I'm going to actually show you a few pictures which capture what I've learned. And the first thing I want to show is this is Chicago. In case you missed that, they've got a homicide and violence problem. Actually, it's nice being on the panel with New Orleans, so I don't have to be the butt of all the jokes when I study Chicago. But almost anybody that's looked at violence...
Rahm Emanuel's going to be here in 5 minutes,
that's great.
by the
Right,
way.
that's why I got it out now.
Yeah.
But anybody who's looked at a crime map in any city in this country has seen something like this. The really severe spatial concentration of violence in the same neighborhoods over long periods of time. These are all the non-fatal shootings in Chicago over an extended period of times. And you see some parts of Chicago that have homicide rates 55 per 100,000. National average is about 3, by the way. The city average in Chicago is about 12 to 13. And believe it or not, Chicago has its lowest rates in almost 50 years. But there are some neighborhoods in Chicago, just as much as you said, has a severe concentration of violence over time. And you could actually layer any other form of inequality, educational attainment, infectious disease, obesity, and they would cluster in the same areas. And so when we talk about gun violence, we almost always start here. Right? We show a map, we figure out the communities that are hardest hit, and then we try to develop programs around it. And this we've known for 150 years or so. This actually hasn't changed in most cities. And as a side note, one of the most incredible levels of inequality we have to change in this country moving forward is what I'm calling the crime gap, which is the gap between the safest and the most unsafe communities. And a lot of the discussion this morning about inequality, I feel like that needs to be added. But where is data taking us in the work that I've been doing that's being applied in New Orleans and other cities? It has to do with social networks, right? Because if we think about all the professors that have done this type of work, we end up with an equation that says, look, too much poverty, too much inequality, not enough employment means higher rates of crime. But we can never answer the question about who's going to get shot, right? And that's actually what I want to talk about very briefly. What I'm showing you right here is not a brain scan. It's actually a social network of 170,000 individuals in the city of Chicago. So you can't actually see it, but I'll show you some other pictures. This is Chicago's criminal network. It's actually less than 4% of the city's population, and it's responsible, and all of the violence, 85% of all fatal and non-fatal shootings happen in this network, right? Which is everything. The other 15%, by the way, are domestic violence and the stray bullet killings. But the lion's share of violence happens in these networks. But let me just show you a different city, Boston. Each one of those dots is an individual, right? And this is actually 563 dots. You can try to count them very quickly. Those red dots are people who have been shot or shot and killed, right? This is a social network. This is not Facebook social network. These are actually incidents of co-arrest, right? You were doing something with somebody. You can actually take these pieces of data, which are, many of which are public data. I'm not even talking about NSA secret data. I'm talking about interactions that we can observe and create these networks. And then once again in Boston, in this one community in Boston, it was 6% of the population, 85% of the gunshot injuries, almost all of them. What's important to remember is every one of those dots has the risk factors that we're familiar with. They're young men, mainly young men. They're young minority men. They live in the same neighborhood. But the vast majority of people in this neighborhood don't get shot or don't shoot anybody. It's contained within these small networks. That's the biggest finding we've had these last 5 to 6 years. It's just how severely concentrated within communities, within populations that are already at elevated risk. And our research suggests that just being in this network with all these shootings going on increases your risk of victimization by almost 900%, right? And every one of those dots is one of these young men with a felony record in many cases, but at least in contact with the criminal justice system. And I'll speed along just to show you it's not Boston and Chicago. We find similar findings in New Haven, Connecticut. Over the last 6 months in New Haven, where I'm working right now, almost all of the shootings happened in a network of less than 400 individuals. And every one of those dots is a human being, right? And this is the world that police, that street workers, that football coaches, that educators, that outreach workers, they live in. They see these networks. This is how our world works. That's how many of us got here. And what we're trying to do is use this network science to piece it all together, to literally give you a roadmap for places for intervention, prevention, or policing efforts, and to do so in a way that could direct very scarce resources to those at the most immediate risk, right? And I'm happy to chat about what that means relative to other sorts of populations. Just a couple other images. Here's Newark, New Jersey. Again, you can't see it very well with these images, but the sort of stringing together of these shootings in very small social networks. Here's East Palo Alto, California. We see the same sorts of patterns. And Stockton, California as well, right? So lots of very different cities. It's hard to read. If anybody wants to take a look at these, I'm happy to share them. But that's the biggest thing we're finding. It's not just about space. It's about people in those space and finding ways to connect to them using the resources we already have. But the big takeaway is the severe risk of just being in one of these networks and then trying to leverage that for prevention efforts.
Well, one very, very quick question, a technical question. I don't know if there's an average, as you say, but of these are only shootings.
These are only shootings.
Only
correct.
shootings. What percentage, on average, in these cities are homicides through shootings? Is it upward of 90%?
So it's about equivalent. So there's usually 5 or 6 non-fatal shootings for every 1 shooting in most of the cities I'm in.
No, I'm also talking non-shooting homicides.
Oh, non-shooting homicides.
Are we talking about a problem that is almost entirely gun?
So if you give me more time, I'm happy to talk about why I think it relates to gun violence.
We'll come back around.
We can come back to that. But gun violence is very particular, right? It requires a gun. It's a durable good. And sort of the uses of guns are about things like safety, protection, and peers. So there's a lot that has to do with guns themselves.
Jamira, you can just talk about your experience in Philadelphia and what you've seen and related to the social networking that we're talking about.
Well, since I'm a reform student, I won't be using a slide. But one thing I will say is 2 points to add to your research or to the information that you provided is that, one, we've learned in Philadelphia, particularly based on the information you provided, is that a lot of those people who are perpetrators are also victims, and they also come from a very concentrated area. In Philadelphia, we have 27 families that we've identified that actually do more than 80 to 90% of the violence in Philadelphia, and so we're able to identify who the perpetrators are. The question is how to then think about prevention and intervention as a way to really reform the violence that they create.
How many people total in those 27 families?
Less than 200 people who are responsible for pushing and creating a lot of the violence. But the point that I want to address is really one thing that my police commissioner in Philadelphia likes to always say is that we know more about a person after they died than during their lifetime. And that's because there's so much information and data out there that's already available, but the problem is we have systems in place that don't share that information across sectors and across agencies. For instance, when you particularly think about young people who hurt people, who many times they have been victims of gun violence and then later on become a perpetrator of gun violence. For many of them, they were in multiple systems. They were in DHS. They've been in the juvenile justice system. But unfortunately, because those systems aren't sharing information and data, we can't think about comprehensive ways to really think about prevention as a solution. Over the last probably 3 years, my mayor, Michael Nutter, through the National Forum for Youth Violence, we created a cohort of power players, which make up our commission. So we have the police commissioner on board, we have the secretary of DHS, we also have the head of the police courts, and they're now sharing information in a way that's never been done before. So we're really able to overlap that information and see what really are the cause and effects of young people who become victims as well as perpetrators of violence. And now we're able to look at the systems in place and the policies and practices that are also being provided by those systems that are also pushing for many of those young people to be placed in systems where they might be harmed or be a perpetrator of violence. And so that's really what we've learned in the last decade, I guess. I've been doing this work since I was 15, but in the last decade is really that we need to start asking better questions and sharing information to be more proactive in preventing gun violence versus reactive.
David, if you can maybe spend a minute explaining what your firm does.
Sure.
And explain how that data has changed the way the cities that use your service are actually combating gun violence.
Sure. So I'd like to share my personal experience. Clearly, after 25 years of working at ATF, I felt confident that I knew what was going on with respect to gun violence. And I think my experience has been, over the last couple of years, I've had to unlearn every assumption I had made. I too worked for 25 years on this scorecard of if fewer people are being killed with guns, we're doing better. And so it's sort of this body count approach that I'll tell you, being amidst of it, is very depressing. I think I can share with everyone quickly what I was forced to learn in a story. What we do is we set up acoustical sensors. We hear gunfire, we triangulate it to a specific spot, we have humans review this information, and we use technology to push this to law enforcement in under a minute. So the reality today for those partnerships that we have with police is if there's a shooting in their area, they can get an alert on their iPhone, which shows the exact place where the shot went off, and actually play an audio of it. I can't tell you how different my experience as an ATF agent was. I mostly relied on what Pookie told me, the informant I paid $50. I mean, that is how, you know, when you hear about intelligence-led policing, where we really are. But what's exciting is we're at the brink of a new day because technology, big data, has finally gotten to the point where operators like myself might choose to look at things differently, and that's where anything is possible. We did a test in Detroit. We had a police chief who wanted to prove to naysayers that a system worked. And so this was a very pivotal point in our company's history. He wanted to do a live test of the system, have media there, and all stakeholders. So this is one of these things where it's great or the company's going downhill. And so we set up sensors, and the chief went into an inhabited area. There was a vacant park. There were inhabited homes. And he cracked off 10 rounds into a secure thing to see what would happen. We had 2 patrol cars. One patrol car had a laptop in it in which they were going to wait for the ShotSpotter activation and then do what good cops do and respond to a shooting. The other car was going to wait for a 911 call and respond in the same fashion. And then the public could address and see what would happen. Luckily, or I wouldn't be here today, the ShotSpotter did pick up the location. The officers immediately went to the location and found the shell casings that we now know are very critical because then you can tie in all previous shootings and figure out what these 2 participants had already told you. It's a very small amount of people driving all this violence. And now we have a way to link all those prior shootings, and we don't have to wait till someone's actually dead. The other car doesn't arrive. The police chief is now feeling panicked. Like, what happened? Did the dispatch center mess up? What's going on? The reality is no one called 911. Now, I had a sense. I worked in Detroit, I worked in Texas, I worked in Virginia in my job. I had a sense that gun violence was underreported. I think I've had to come to the stark realization that in certain areas of cities, it's never reported. What we are as law enforcement is we're being undertakers, and we're trying to solve crimes after the fact. ATF, after the fact. You know, and that's sad when we have all this data available. So the police chief in this test was shocked because he had picked a location where there were residents. And so he went with cameras on and knocked on a door, and this elderly woman answered the door. And she said, "Hi, Chief." Well, that made him happy because he was recognized on camera, so that worked out well. And he asked, he said, "Ma'am, did you hear the gunfire?" And she said, "Yes." "Did you call the police?" "Well, Chief, that's not my protocol." He says, "You have a gunfire protocol?" And she said, "Well, we live in Detroit. Of course I do. My protocol, I'm a grandmother. I care for my daughter's 2 young children. When I hear gunfire, we rush into the basement and we hang out there for a half an hour." Now, I'd like to say that I wasn't totally detached from my job, but I don't think that I understood really what it was like to live in communities like this. And so what we hope to do at ShotSpotter, and last year we had 51,000 shootings in the small areas that we cover. Some of these areas, there are 1,000 shootings per square mile. A shooting to me is clearly those people have been shot and killed, those people have been wounded, but also those people where someone had the intention to blow someone's head off, but they just happened to miss. I mean, this all causes fear in a community, and I hope that with our data, people can really measure what is the impact of that. And I hope to make the scorecard really, you know, are we lowering shootings? And the beauty of this is an independent measurement of that fact that cannot be fudged. It's science. And it will more quickly tell us that those police interventions are working that are targeting shootings, or they're not. And we got to reframe.
Mitch, there's a lot on your plate here. Deal with everything that people have talked about.
Okay.
And also just let me throw in one other thing into the mix, something you said to me the last time I visited you in your city, which surprised me given the percentage of homicides and non-fatal violence that is gun-related, where you told me that in many ways you don't have a gun problem, you have a culture problem. I want you to talk about that in the context of everything that's been said.
Let me thank you very much. It's great to be here, and thank all of you. Let me start at 100,000 feet and jump all the way down to 1 foot on the ground. So New Orleans, you know, got beat to death after Katrina. Katrina and Rita didn't cause all of our problems. We were a major American city that had everything bad and everything good before the storm hit. But the storm hurt 500,000 homes. It destroyed 250,000. Walter Isaacson came home and led the Louisiana recovery effort. Thank you for that. We have, since that time, though, been building back a city in a very amazing way. And on the good side of the ledger, New Orleans is outpacing most other cities in America in how we're rebuilding the city. Not like it was, but we're taking this as an opportunity to do new, innovative stuff that the city of New Orleans never had, while simultaneously trying to prepare for the future and preserve our past, not only in our structure and in our bones, but in our soul. And so we are reconstructing our healthcare delivery system, our education system, our transportation system, our housing system, and that's gone great. It's all gone spectacularly well. And it's gone well because the people of the city decided to come together and focus on fixing the things that we know how to fix. We know the answers to how you fix transportation. We know how you fix housing. We know how you fix education. We know how you fix healthcare. That is a matter of political will, of finding the right people, designing a strategy, creating a vision, and then moving the resources to that. We already understand that. The one thing that nobody, in my opinion, knows how to do is to stop black boys from killing black boys. Now, President Obama's initiative is My Brother's Keeper. That encapsulates a lot of stuff. But in New Orleans, one of the things that we see, that I believe is emblematic, by the way, of every place in the country, is African-American boys and men killing each other. Now, The way it came to me, though, was, look, you're the mayor of the city. You've got all these problems to fix. You got to bring down the crime rate. And when I was running, it was like, get a new police chief, plus up your police department that was under the, guidance of a consent decree. Learn how to get ahead, know where the crime is, target your police to where the crime is. That make sure your judges are talking to your district attorney. Make sure there are consequences for actions. And then as a consequence of the criminal justice system responding and making sure there's a certain consequence to an action, then people will choose not to engage in bad behavior because they will be afraid to go away for the rest of their life. And if you do that, everything's going to be good. So I set about doing that. So we created something called the Multi-Agency Gang Unit. I've got the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, the district attorney, the U.S. attorney, my police chief, the police chiefs from the region, and we're on it like a dog on a bone. But the question got to be that, well, where are you going to go? Where's the crime? So now I'm a mayor of a major city. I'm on CNN. We're a major convention town. Somebody asked me this question, Mr. Mayor, is your city safe? We want to bring the Super Bowl there. What's the answer to the question? Thank you. The answer to the question is, of course, my city's safe. Anybody that wants to come to my city that can travel, that wants to come for a Super Bowl, stay downtown at our 38,000 hotel rooms, eat at our beautiful restaurants, listen to Trombone Shorty play, head over to Giacomo's to get some chicken. It's a great place and it's wonderful, unless you're a young black male between 16 and 25, unless you're in one of these networks that the professor has identified for you, and unless you live in one of 4 neighborhoods. The answer then is you're endangered every day, all day. Question, well, what's wrong with your city? Why are y'all so much worse than everybody else? Why is your homicide rate, 40, 50 times the national average? That's a good question. So how do you know the answer to that question? Well, that's when data comes in. And I told my team, we have a very clear mission as it relates to this issue. Now, remember, I'm not talking about here all violent crime everywhere. I'm specifically talking about young African-American men killing young African-American men. Why? Because when we did the data dump, when we asked who was killing, when were they killing, why were they killing, how were they killing, and we got through all the complicated permutations and algorithms, and we worked with the professor and David Kennedy, what we found out was that there are probably 7,000 people. We have 380 in the city, 7,000 people that were at risk of shooting or being shot. Of those 7,000, there were about 800 of them that were the most violent. We thought we could find out who they were and where they lived, which we did. And then we found out that they belonged to, now let's stop here, groups or gangs. Now, when you say gangs, and you got the Medellin cartel, and you got the Blood and the Crips, and you got a whole bunch of stuff going on in South Central and Latin America, the question was it like them? Because are these drug wars over the importation? That's not what this is. These are loose gatherings of young men who get together to comfort each other and get from their friends what they never got from their father or their mother or their friends. And collectively, because they ain't got anything else to do, or because they haven't been formed the right way, or because they haven't been loved, or because they haven't been valued, primarily because they've been disrespected and forsaken, have decided to act a certain way. And what they have learned since the beginning of the time they came in is how to react to disrespect by hurting somebody and killing somebody. Because when you drill down with these young men about why'd you shoot, here's the other statistic. Of all the guys that are shooting each other, 95% with handguns, 88% of them know each other. So this is not, is Walter at risk for going to the store and making groceries, like we say in New Orleans, and getting out of his car and getting carjacked? It happens sometimes, right? But most of the murders in New Orleans, 90% of them, are young African-American men shooting somebody that they know over what? Some level of disrespect. Now, why? The question that we began to ask is, well, what's the impetus for this? Why then is the violence occurring? Which gets me to the issue of, it obviously relates to guns, but it's got to be more than guns. People said, well, it's because people are not working. Well, that's really interesting. How many people in this country are not working, right, that are not shooting each other? How many people in this country have guns that are not shooting each other? All right, it has to do with living in a certain neighborhood. How many people are living in a poor neighborhood and not shooting each other? So I've come to the conclusion, after having all of the data, that this is a much, much deeper problem that this country has got to get a grip on. Now, I love Mayor Bloomberg. He's a patron of mine. I think he's spectacular, and he did a great job in New York of reducing the number of murders from 2,200 down to 600. That's just a fantastic, no matter how you cut it. The same thing is true, by the way, of Chicago. And if you measure major cities that have large white populations with small African-American populations, then, just because of the math, your per capita rate of murder is really low. But here's the problem. You don't really count bodies per capita. You count bodies by body. And when you ask yourself how many people were actually killed in Chicago and how many people were killed in New York, it's twice as many that were killed in New Orleans. So even though my per capita rate is higher, because I have a higher population of people that would be at risk, when you count it at bodies, and then here's the data thing that really made difference to me. When you look around the country and you plug in all the demographic data, you will find there are about 85 to 90 neighborhoods in this country in every major American city where if you're a young African-American boy and you live in this kind of environment, you are at risk of getting killed at 100 times the national average. That, in my opinion, is a national epidemic that requires us to think about not just, so ShotSpotter is, what he was telling you is a great device, but what it does is tell you where the shots are. It gets you there after the fact, or originally, and then it helps you do proactive policing on the front end, but it's all after people have been raised up, they're teenagers, and they're in the war. What we're talking about at Yale and at Philadelphia is what are the reasons, what are the environments, personal responsibility, structural inequities that have created this culture of behavior that allows somebody to shoot somebody in the head over something that's just disrespect. And I don't think we know the answer to that in this country. And quite frankly, I'm almost finished, Jeffrey. Quite frankly, I'm not sure that many people in the country care about it. I'm not sure people care about it, because if you ask yourself why people stand up and take notice of certain things, you can understand why they do it in Trayvon Martin. You can understand why they do it in Ferguson. I don't know if you remember Gina, Louisiana, but you can understand that too. That's a different issue in some ways, equal application of the law to different people based on the same circumstances than it is, because as Mayor Nutter said this yesterday, 40 people are going to get killed in this country today. 40 people will get killed today. Maybe more people than get killed in the theater of war, depending on where in the world that's happening, and it happens every day. And Walter's heard this number before, but since 1980 in this country, 630,000 people have been killed on the streets of America, which is more people that were killed in all of the wars. Did you hear what I said? All of the wars, all Americans killed in the wars that we fought in the 20th century. That's a big number. But for some reason, it doesn't make people stand up and stop and say, no, no, no. Whatever it is that we're doing, we've got to do something differently. Hopefully, the data will take us to waking people up to say, this is not who we are as a country.
Mitch, I want to come back to this issue, which is a hot-button cultural sensitivity issue of black-on-black crime, the expression that people use sometimes as a shorthand. But let me just, I mean, if I were a cynic, and I'm not, but if I were a cynic, I would say, you're putting a lot of emphasis on culture, in part because you're a politician in a southern state that is pro-gun, relentlessly pro-gun, and that there's not a lot you can do to change the dynamic of illegal guns coming into your city and dealing with that. I mean, if the simple fact remains, if you had many fewer guns accessible to people on the street, you could kill people all kinds of ways. You can kill them with knives, you can kill them with bats, but it's just much harder to kill large numbers of people without guns. So, I mean, can you take that on? I mean, I know,
I'll answer it directly. First of all, that's irrefutable. That if individuals who were violent did not have access to guns, fewer people would get killed. That's just irrefutable. And it is also true that there are lots of people that have guns, right, that are not using them to shoot other people. So the answer here is it's not either or, it's both and. And even if you took the guns out of hands of everybody, it would not change the behavioral. So what is culture? All right? Good culture, bad culture. Behavioral patterns that develop over time that produce a result, like how your mama taught you how to make your gumbo, or the meatballs, or whether or not you got a peanut butter and jelly sandwich when you went to school, or the kind of music and the songs that you play. That's good stuff, right? Well, cultural patterns are developed poorly as well, like how do you discipline your children? Do you do it through words, or do you do it with a stick? How do you resolve your differences with a friend? Well, the question in the United States of America is, why are we so violent? Because we, in fact, are by numbers. If you look at the numbers, We're a very, very violent society, not just by murders, but by shootings. Why are we that way? Why do we react to that? And why is it seeming to affect just one clear segment? So when you talk about black on black crime, when people say it this way, answer the question, let's say it another way. What are we going to do to stop young African American men from becoming the victims of murder in a disproportionate level to the numbers that exist? So let's give them to them. African American population is 10% of the United States of America. African American men, 5.5%, 6%. Yet in terms of murders, 13,000 last year, right? African American men were 45% of the victims. So look at it from the victim's perspective and ask yourself whether or not they deserve special attention and special treatment to make sure that they are as free and they are as safe as anybody else. When you do it that way, you don't so much get into the cultural wars of whether Paul Ryan said the right thing or Bill O'Reilly said the right thing or Reverend Sharpton talked about it in a particular way. It seems to me that they are very important to this country. We should say that. We should say that they are behind the 8 ball and they need help. And if you approach it from that perspective, it takes a little bit of the sting out of the issues that we're talking about.
I want to come back to this cultural hot button issue in a minute, and we'll finish that before we go to questions. But on the gun quote, let me just ask Jamira, and then we'll have you both jump in. Am I wrong in thinking that? Oh, really? I'm just not wrong.
No, you're not wrong in thinking that guns play a role in the violence.
A role or the role? I mean, if you could remove magically the illegal guns, haven't you solved your problem?
It's not just the illegal guns. It's also the personal cell guns. It's also the cells that are given or that are sold at
What I'm saying is if you could deal with the gun issue in its totality.
It will decrease.
And maybe that's a fantasy in this country right now, and we'll have the ATF weigh in a second on that. But I mean, is it wrong to think, and please jump in, that like if you're going to target an effort here, remove the guns from the battlefield and the battlefield becomes less of a fatal place?
I would say yes, and I think the number shows that. I mean, 33 people die in America due to gun violence. We know that women who are killed by intimate partners, 80% of the time is due to guns. And so I get Mayor Landrieu's point, and we do a lot of work in regards to Cities United, Black Men and Boys, but we have to recognize that when young men kill each other, more than likely it's with guns, and it's that snap-second decision. We talk about culture a lot of times, and I've had conversations with my elders, and they'll tell you that we used to get into a scruffle with a guy on the street, and that's just what it was, a scruffle. We'll get up later, shake hands, and move on. Nowadays, you have a young man who's disrespected by someone in his neighborhood. They get into a fight, and that split second, he pull out a gun, and he kills someone. And so I do think guns play a role, and if we remove them from the equation, we really have the opportunity to decrease the amount of lives.
Is one of the reasons that we're not talking about guns as much as maybe we used to, because we all sort of tacitly understand that it's an impossible problem. There's 300 million guns in this country, one for every person, and that we're just not going to run a magnet across America and suck up all the illegal guns?
Well, I'm going to set Dave up with a softball on this one too, but it also speaks to the tension here, which is when we say 300 million guns, let me just say the word network one more time. The guns we are actually talking about are a small portion of all guns in this country. They're guns that get transferred illegally. They're by definition illegal guns that are going through a secondary market where we have no regulation. But more than that, we have almost near uniform agreement and upwards of 70% on both sides of the political spectrum about this market. And let me tell you the thing as a scientist, and this is the theme, we have zero data on these weapons that are used in crimes. And when you see NCIS, the work that they use to trace these guns with these computers, it's nonsense. This is 1920s police work.
NCIS isn't
It's
real?
Not real. It's not real. What you have to do to trace a firearm would appall you on a session in a place where we're talking about big data and Uber and all that shit, excuse me, all that stuff. Like, to trace a firearm, you have to physically go to a federally licensed dealer to look for a piece of paper, and if they don't have that piece of paper...
And that could be hundreds of miles away from the crime scene.
And I've heard horror stories from ATF agents where dealers sometimes turn in their records literally written on toilet paper and on records because we don't allow that part to be regulated, and that's a larger issue. But to both these points, the guns that are used everybody agrees are illegal. There are people who are not allowed to possess them by law, even in Louisiana, though they were debating giving felons back their gun laws recently. But it's a very specific type of gun, and people agree, but we don't see movement on this particular market.
Well, the reason why we don't have the research, though, is because there's legislation that actually prevents government agencies from doing that.
And that's the beauty of having a company in which the NRA can't shut down the data because we own it. We don't sell our equipment. We set up these systems, and we own the data.
But talk about the larger.
I think for me, as a practitioner, there is no way I can tell you who the shooters are in a community if I do not know all of the shootings. In a typical police department, they only know about 10% of the shootings, because those are the ones that are reported to police. The other 90% are never reported. Let me say that another way. How would you like living in a community where only the fire department responded to 1 in 10 fires? So it is not a mystery to me why in certain communities people are brought up thinking that they have to carry a gun to survive. So I would disagree a bit with this conversation that I do believe that there are things to do on the front end that can allow people to make choices, the same ones I did growing up. I didn't grow up on 8 Mile. I grew up at 30 Mile, which is a lot of difference in Michigan. I never worried about getting shot, ever. You know, in Detroit, people are worrying about how do I get to school without my head getting blown off. And so at ShotSpotter, that's why we focus not on guns. We focus on shooting. Shooting in an urban environment is against the law. And until we have the capability to respond in every shooting, we have a major problem. I was talking with David Kennedy. He came and looked at some of our data, and that was an honor. I think David's been in the game a long time. And we put up a map of all of the shooting in this one area of Oakland and where the 911 calls were, to prove the point that only 10% of the gunfire was getting reported. And he said, oh my God, this is remarkable. And I thought, what, the clarity of our overhead? What is it? And he said, no. He says, I heard that you said it's 10%. What I didn't understand is there are whole segments of this city where they never call. What does that mean? We just set up a system in Detroit, one last thing. For 2 weeks, they've had 60 shootings in a 3 mile area. Not a single one has been reported to police. Not one.
Does that happen in New Orleans?
Absolutely. Why would they call? I mean, look, I know all of us social scientists go and look at this data. You just go ask the people. Yeah. You know, why you carrying? You get a bunch of kids that you know are in the system that have been shot. I mean, I peeled a guy off the street that had 3 bullets in him. After he got, you know, better, we put him in a program called Cafe Reconcile, worked with him, got a bunch of kids who sit around and say, tell me what's going on. Hey, Mayor, it's out here. It's either kill or be killed. Why do you have a gun? I have a gun because if I don't have a gun, I'm going to get shot. Why don't you call the police? Police are not coming. And we don't like them. You got this whole, I mean, this takes you, the reason you have to start here is because it takes you everywhere. And now listen, I'm not trying to skate away from the gun thing. I'm a Second Amendment guy, but I'm on a record. I'm with mayors of against illegal guns. I'm for reasonable restrictions on handguns. But what I'm saying to you is this, is that even if and when you address that problem, it can't absolve you from addressing the much, much deeper problems that are producing the environment and the behavioral patterns that these kids are engaging in, and then walk away from them as though everything is okay. So like it is very helpful, for example, it seems to me, and the NRA has really kind of, if you can imagine this, has drifted more to the right in the last couple of years. After the Sandy Hook, we had a long national debate, primarily about assault rifles. Actually, it was only about assault rifles. But if you look at the data, not that any killing in this country that was done by assault rifle was not something that we should pay attention to. But if you're looking at the numbers, and you ask yourself who's getting killed and what are they getting killed with, it's mostly people getting killed with handguns. And we really never had a reasonable debate about that. The NRA, if you listen to Wayne LaPierre and you listen to the president talk, there are 2 things actually that they agree on right now, 3, that we could do if the politics would matter. One of them is more police officers. The NRA calls them resource officers in and around the schools. And everybody else, we're getting ready to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the COPS program, right, what Bill Clinton and Biden did about more police officers that are community police officers that act in a completely different way from how the police officers acted in Ferguson. There's almost complete agreement in that in Congress, and they can't move that forward. Another is to taking illegal guns off of the street, although the NRA now says we don't even want to talk about that. And the third one is to make sure that the federal government has direct authority to prosecute people for just gun crimes. They don't have that now. All they can do is do it in concert with drug crimes. Those are three things that almost everybody in the country agrees on and would help really target some of these violent things, but we can't get that done either.
Let me come back, before we go to question, let me come back to this culture question for a minute.
Sure.
Because you and I mean, we're working on a big project at the Atlantic on this subject, and we've talked about this. The critique of focusing on African Americans and using and talking about culture in a particular community, a particular race, is that you've heard the argument that nobody ever talks about white on white crime in America. There's a lot of white on white crime, right? And nobody talks about it as a white pathology, or as they talk about it as poverty, they talk about it economic, they talk about various things, but they don't reframe it as a white problem. The other critique of focusing in on this is that it marginalizes the problem. I mean, there's one of the reasons that this problem exists to this day is that a lot of people in the United States say it's a black problem, right? I mean, you've seen this directly. And so the question is, and the third piece of it is, and address this part in particular, is you have plenty of African American communities where this doesn't happen.
Correct.
So therefore, I mean, so talk about the dangers, if you will, of framing this in the way that you're framing.
Well, okay, listen.
And then please jump in.
Let me say this: if someone
panel
can find a better word for it, I'd love to hear it. But culture, the word, a pattern of behavior that develops over time that produces a result, a color, a texture, a music, a food, killing, etc. The numbers take you where they take you. You don't have, and we can stop talking about it if people want, but nobody's ever said it is a quote-unquote black problem. And people who say that don't really understand. This is a national problem. If you don't find a way to help and resurrect the young African American in this country will never be strong. It never will. People who are dismissive about it say it's a black problem, like it's not me. You actually hear from African Americans and whites. It's more of a class thing. You have middle-class African Americans that say, hey man, that's not my deal. That's those kids over there. My kids are in my neighborhood with me, and we're going, I'm a police officer, and my wife's a pharmacist, and my kids are doing good, and they're doing better than us. That's not me. What I'm telling them, it's everybody. And what's happening in that community, even though it is racially separate from where you are, and although you can't somehow connect with it, is affecting the livelihood of you in a very direct way. I'll give you a crass example. The tourism industry in New Orleans says, wait a minute, we had a shooting on Bourbon Street and 9 people got shot. I said, oh, you care about it now? Why? Because people are not going to travel to New Orleans and go to Bourbon Street. On that same day when the kids from Bourbon Street got shot, in that week before, 10 people got killed in the neighborhoods and nobody said anything about it. Right? So this, to me, this is why you have to raise the issue up and talk about it in a way, and you have to go where the data is. Now, lots of times people speak about this. When you hear black on black crime, it's like I'm blaming the black kid for shooting. That's really what they're saying. But if you talk about it from the victim's perspective and say, why are African American being killed at exponentially higher rates in America, irrespective of who's doing the shooting, why don't they deserve the same kind of protection we would give to any other victim of crime? You see that from a different perspective.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go come down the row, and then we'll go to questions. Yeah.
So I don't perceive this as a cultural issue. I, like Andrew, and I was very impressed with the article he had put earlier. This is a question of different people living in different places have different expectations of what public safety is to them. Where I grew up, if someone fired a gun, there would have been 20 officers on the scene immediately. In parts of Oakland, and I want to share a brief story, they never come unless there's a body. That means that to survive there, it's not a cultural issue, it's you do different things. I was talking with an Oakland police officer, and we were sort of exchanging war stories, and I said, well, what's the worst you've been through? And he said, actually, it happened 8 months ago. He said, we had a shooting, and a 3-year-old girl had been struck in the leg, not fatally, but screaming, and an officer was trying to calm her until her mother came. The mother arrived and immediately grabbed the child, shook her, and said, quit crying like a little bitch. I taught you to be a soldier. And to me, that's a horrifying story, but it gives a glimpse of Well, what was that mother doing? She was trying to raise a child in a part of the city that she didn't expect would ever get better, that police wouldn't be there to help unless someone got shot. And so to me, on the front end, we've got to do a better job using the big data that we have to give everyone an equal response. And so I reject the notion entirely that we don't have enough money or that we don't have enough focus to do a better job doing basic public safety work. We've got time to kick people out of walking down the center of a street. We certainly got time to respond to an actual shooting, and we're not doing it yet.
Jamira and then Ann.
So I must have heard wrong, but I thought you two actually said the same thing in regards to culture, but I could be wrong, and I'll say this for one. And I'll say this because I grew up in some of the worst neighborhoods that Philadelphia has to offer, in an environment where young people had two expectations: either get killed or be incarcerated. That was a part of the culture. You woke up every day, had an expectation that you might be killed that day. And that's why a lot of people walked around with a handgun. It's because they knew that if they didn't have it, that guy would. And so I would say, when we think about gun violence and we think about violence in general, particularly as it affects minorities and young men of color, the reason why Cities United focus on men of color is because we recognize that the solutions has to be different because the indicators are different, meaning that young men are killing each other for very different reasons than the violence that's happening in Sandy Hook.
Correct.
And so how can we address those in a very cohesive way that doesn't just look at enforcement and that doesn't just look at incarceration? You have to think about prevention and intervention and what services need to be pushed to those communities to stop young men from killing each other at disproportionate rates. Like, we say young men because they account for 10% of the American population, but they count for more than almost 50% of the victims. That is a national epidemic that no one's talking about, but if we had that many victims being affected by some kind of Ebola, you would see the president on TV every other day.
So Andrew, Mike Nutter and I started this organization together, and we've spoken specifically about this because when the president did My Brother's Keeper and wanted to expand for brown kids and black kids and women, we said, listen, you can do that, that's great, but we're going to stay focused because the data says to on young African American men killing each other and finding out why that is. That's why City United is focused like a laser beam, because the data reflects that there's something different happening in and amongst those young men, irrespective of anywhere in the country they might be, if they fall within the parameters of the research that the doctor has done here.
So, does anybody remember the Benji Wilson? Does that name mean anything to anybody? 30 years ago, basketball phenom, actually, was Chicago. He was the Hadiya Pendleton of 1984 in Chicago. One of the things that's really I want to close with is those networks I was showing. If 4-6% of the population is killing each other, that means 94 and 96% of the population is not. Mm-hmm. The trick is you have to be a part, you have to understand the cultures and the codes just to survive, just to get by those neighborhoods. But that first map I showed you, the west side of Chicago, which was the highest concentration of violence, it's not surprisingly the African American, that's been the highest level of community violence in Chicago for 150 years. When it was Irish, when it was Italian, when it was German, then Jewish, then Polish. It's consistently, there's a lot to do with place, but more important, inequality. There's a magazine that ran that story, The Case for Reparations. I forget which one it was. Yeah. But there's something in that story about durable inequality that generates the stage on which this unfolds, that everyone that lives in that community has to play. Whether or not they pull the trigger comes up to the minutiae of the interactions, the contests that are happening on the streets, the availability of firearms, but inequality sets the stage. Long-term crime reduction, it entails dealing with that durable inequality. Right. Short-term requires looking for that 4 or 5% and how to get your hands on them. And one last thing, and this is important. Every single one of those dots I showed you was a young man with a criminal record. If we want to reduce crime, the homicide number today, we have to help those part of the population, not just Hadiya Pendleton, not just Benji Wilson. We actually have to care about them and want to save those lives and value those lives.
That's exactly right.
That was great.
That's exactly
Thank you.
right.
We're going to go to questions. There's a mic coming. Why don't you come here? And also, we have a lot of mayors scattered about the room. I would love to hear from one or two about your own experiences.
Are there any telling examples or innovations at the city level that are getting the illegal guns off the street? Could you talk about any of those?
Well,
from any city?
Let me take a crack at that. Again, we talk about guns, but we also talk about violence. So we've created a plan in New Orleans called NOLA for Life that gets on the early end, the middle end, and the back end. So the first thing we tell guys, we have something, so David Kennedy and these guys confected it with something they call the Group Violence Reduction Strategy. All right, that is a specific way, like ceasefire is a way, or Head Start is a way. And what we do is, through our data dumps, we identify the most violent 800 kids or people in the city. We know who they are by face and by name. We have pictures of them actually in the neighborhood. And what we do every 3 months is we identify 30 or 40 of them that are on probation, a number of them that are in jail. We bring them into the courtroom, a courthouse. And I, as the mayor, stand in the middle of the room. And on the left-hand side of me is all the law enforcement that I could find, ATF, DEA. They're all there in their uniforms. And on this side of the room is the pastor, the social workers, mental health, substance abuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of quickly goes like this. The entire city came here to pay attention to you today. Because whether you believe it or not, we love you and we care about you. And we came to tell you that the rules of engagement have changed and the shooting has to stop today. It has to stop. And you're going to stop because the community is going to help work with you to make it stop. You have two choices. The next one of you that shoots, we know who you are. And we then start showing them pictures that we have of them in the community so they know we know who they are. The next one of you that shoots, everybody that you know, every gang that you hang with, every et cetera, is going to get visited by all these guys. And we're going to deliver on our promise. We're going to arrest you. We're going to put you in jail. And you may have to get separated from the community forever. But we don't want you to do that. What we want to do is tell you how much we love you and respect you, and we're going to put you in front of everybody in the city today. So if you want mental health, substance abuse, a job, please come with us after this and go to this side. And we have been doing this all over the country. That has been one of the reasons why we have been able to reduce the murder rate and the numbers of murders in New Orleans in the last 2 years by 30%. 30% reduction. And so this is, again, person by person, me to them understanding their consequences, and them choosing to do a different thing. And that's just one of the many strategies. Now, we're also working on increasing recreation, midnight basketball, getting into early reading programs, changing all of the things that we're working on. But that one particular strategy came out of the work that we've been doing together with the data that reflected who the guys are and how actually to speak to them. But they have to stop the shooting first. It's hard to really kind of, if you think about this, when someone's having a heart attack, right, you got to save them first before you can talk to them about going on a diet. And it's the stopping the shooting and stopping the murder that's the first and the most important reason why we've had some success.
Another six.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
That is,
you know what? We don't even know what. So
we don't even know where they are or how to
start. So I mean, this is one of those issues about data in a world of big data where we don't have it. One of the hypotheses we have, I mean, the gun markets in Louisiana and Illinois, they have to be different. You know, our crime guns in Chicago come from 3 places. They come from the suburbs. They come from Indiana, which is, for those of you that know your geography, is like a 15-minute walk from the south side of Chicago. And then they come from Mississippi, 1 zip code in Mississippi. And so that's basically what we know. We don't have, whereas a state where it's very low gun law.
You can rent a gun right now.
Yeah,
I can take you down the street in the neighborhood that I live in, and I can put you with one of my partners, and you can go rent a gun for $25 and bring it back 3 hours later.
That's
it's like renting a movie.
I was about to say, in Philadelphia, we do a number of gun bag programs every single day in Philadelphia, but the problem is you can't eliminate guns until you address why people feel the need to carry them in the first place. And one thing I will say is that there's many neighborhoods across the country where a young person can rent a gun before they can rent a book. And that's a problem when you talk about disparities.
With just one final thing. Again, it's not about the gun, it's about the shooter. And the only way that you know which shooter is driving the most crime is to know all of your shootings, be able to match those shootings with shell casings, determine are 100 shootings, are 20 of them with the same gun, and then find out who that person driving those 20 shootings and then taking them off the street. That's more important than buying back 300 guns that were in someone's attic. And I'm just telling you, for 25 years, I had no ability to do what I just said. We're in a new era where data can make that happen, and it's happening in cities.
My younger brother, Maurice, is the head of the street crimes unit as a prosecutor in the Eastern District, which is where we come from. I'm not going to tell you the kid's name, but he's got a kid right now that is under indictment that's going to go away for the rest of his life. He's 22 years old that killed 19 people. The shooter. And to the 7%, and finding them and using data to do that. are having expert technology, like NCIS, by the way, that actually puts bullet casings with the shooting today that happened a year ago because you kept the data to do that. That helps, too, to find the shooters. And one of the things that has succeeded is when we find the most dangerous people and we're able to take them off the street, it will reduce it. But what that does not do is stop the young children that are coming up in the same environment from becoming a shooter later on. That's why when I say it is guns, I'm not trying to get about, it's not just that. You can't just say, because I've changed the gun laws in Chicago, which are some of the toughest, everything's good and we're not going to have violence in the future. That is not the only way, that pathway that you have to walk down to stop violence.
I want to preface my question with a statement. I was shot 3 times at the age of 17. Within a 14-month time span, I shot 4 people. The 4th person died. I was convicted of second-degree murder and served 19 years in prison. One of the things, as I'm listening to the data, the one thing that I haven't heard come out of any of the data in any research, I do a lot of this work across the nation as well, I just did a TED talk about it, is that we don't deal with post-traumatic stress disorder that exists in our community.
That's true.
We haven't acknowledged it as such. When I got shot, they patched me up. I literally was right back in the same neighborhood, the same block. The police didn't come, the ambulance didn't come. Who came was my friends. And that's how we deal with it. I'm actually from Detroit. I grew up, raised east side and west side of Detroit. I do all my work in Detroit right now. And so, but we haven't dealt with that reality that there's definitely a pathology there. It's not always politically correct to say it, but when you live around it and you watch these kids grow up, I was a kid growing up, in my family, 8 men alone have been shot. My cousin just shot somebody, then committed suicide last week. I just went to his funeral Wednesday. So there's a pathology there that's real. We don't want to acknowledge it in the country because, like y'all say, it affects primarily black males.
Right.
So what's the data saying about post-traumatic stress disorder in these environments? And Detroit has one of the highest murder rates in the nation.
Can I tell you something? It's crazy. You know, you mentioned Hadia Pendleton, who was 16 years old, got killed in Chicago. A couple months earlier, a young kid named Joseph Messengill was from Chicago. He was visiting New Orleans, doing some community work, and he got killed, mistaken identity. Right down the street from there, a little girl was sitting on her sofa with her 1-year-old niece in her arms, and she got shot in the head because a bunch of knuckleheads were outside and they decided to have a fight, and the bullet went through the middle. Now, she went to Lafayette Elementary School. We dispatched an entire mental health team to that school because these children were living in an environment. Now, I want you to look, all the white people in here, listen to me. I don't know if you heard what he just said, but where in your life have you ever heard anybody say to you that many of people that you know in your life got shot? The answer is not. It's not even part of our life. If one of my kids got killed at Ursuline Academy where they went, or as Mike Nutter would say, let me put it in the mouth of an African-American mayor, okay? And if I'm lying, I'm dying. If the Ku Klux Klan killed 300 black kids in America, the world would stop in its tracks. The sun would dim and people, or if 300 black guys kill 300 white guys, but because it's African-American boys killing African-American boys, and the community doesn't have to see it, doesn't have to know about it, doesn't have to hear about it, then we just walk by it like it's not happening. And what I've learned from the data is this stuff is happening all over the country. And I've gotten on Jeffrey a lot because this is one of the greatest international experts around, and I'm not an isolationist. I believe America ought to be strong abroad, and we run lots of places and spend a lot of money saving a lot of people, while at the same time 15,000 people get in the street and nobody's paying attention to it. We go ask for a little money for Congress to fund the cops program, and they say, no, I'm sorry, but the federal government, right, doesn't have any involvement in local law enforcement. And I went, well, wait a minute, you did in Medellin, Colombia. You spent $3 billion providing 50,000 police officers so Medellin could interdict the flow of drugs over here, but you're not going to give us police officers to go into the street and work with these kids?
But you raised a fascinating question. All of you have talked about how these are small populations within large cities. A couple of thousand here, a couple of thousand here. These networks are small. how much money would it take to do the level of PTSD counseling and do the total intervention versus putting them in Angola for the rest of their life, which is the course that they're on.
A lot less.
I mean, talk about maybe you have the numbers on that too.
Yeah, what I said earlier, hurt people. And one thing we noticed with Columbine, two actions happened after Columbine shooting. They sent in mental health experts into the school, and they did not put up metal detectors, what many people don't understand. So they had experts come in and actually talk to people about their feelings and what had happened. You have young men and women who witness gun violence happening every single day on their street, and no one ever asked them what's going on. People don't call the police because they're used to seeing it happen. So when you think about young people who are living in really war zones, they are dealing with so much trauma, and it's not being addressed. One, because money is not being filtered the right way. We have the money, it's not being filtered in the right way. And two, you have systems like the education system where Philadelphia, we just opened our school district with $91 million in debt. And that means nurses are not going to be in school. So when you talk about mental health experts, they're not going to be sent to the neighborhoods that need it the most.
So the last thing I want to say, first of all, thank you for sharing your story. I really appreciate that. And it takes I'm going to go look at your TED Talk. One of the things that people are actually looking at this right now, but they're behind, is the truth, right? We know a couple things. We know that kids that are exposed to violence in their neighborhood, they lose the equivalent of 3 months of school a year simply by not being ready to go to school that day. We know that mentally healthy mothers can mitigate some of the effects, right? So if your mom's got access to it, a good healthcare system, that's a reason why we should care about healthcare and guns, not just about crazy people with guns, by the way, which is not a good thing either. The other thing is I'm working with the MacArthur Foundation right now on a way to leverage this sort of science to identify the people around them, to get help to people like yourself and in your family, where if you're experiencing that around you, we have resources, we have the money. If we directed them to the people who are experiencing the trauma, we could do two things. We could reduce the trauma and we could build resilience, which is the longer term solution in those families and communities. Because if it's going to continue to happen and people aren't calling, in the short term we need to build up that resilience. It involves law enforcement. That's a small part of the problem. We have mental health professionals. A lot of these people are already in the system in different ways, whether it's the health system, the criminal justice system, the education system, and we can get our hands on them in a way that doesn't involve handcuffs, and we should do that immediately around shooting events. And I think we're seeing a concerted effort by lots of people to start doing this. So I hope people are continuing to move in that direction. I know. So.
Which goes to the issue.
And an example of that in South Bend, the police department there is trying to do things differently. They want to develop this resilience. They're tired of people having to grow up to be soldiers to survive. And so when they get a ShotSpotter activation, you know, they go and do police work, but their patrol officers are directed as a matter of policy now to go to 2 doors on either side of the shooting simply to ask if everyone in the home is okay. Does anyone need help? And I'll just tell you, that's nothing I ever saw it done in 25 years. It's just not. And I think where people are looking at this differently.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm the mayor of the city of Rochester, New York, where we have some serious issues around this shooting. We have ShotSpotter, and we have the programs, but we have an issue, I think, around our educational system. Mm-hmm. And our educational system has failed for many generations, and we're starting to see the effects of that. And so I would like to hear from the panel how you're dealing with those issues in your cities in order to change the outcomes on the other side. Because I believe if you deal with young African-American males in the classroom a lot more when they're younger, at pre-K, we all talk about that, this could really change the effects on the other side in our criminal justice system.
So here's the challenge. The answer is absolutely yes, she's right. So like when you take all of these individuals and you put them through a prism, so the other day a pizza man delivery got killed. We found the 2 juveniles that killed him who will now be tried as adults. They will go to Angola for the rest of their lives and will each spend $2 million, and that tragedy bespeaks itself. I'll bet you if you peel back these kids' lives, you'll find out that when they got to school in the beginning, that they have some behavioral problems that got diagnosed, or that, guess what, they didn't get diagnosed and nobody shared it with anybody else. We have to do a much, much better job of identifying those young men very, very early on and making sure that they have what other kids get. It's called resource. This is not an atypical thing that happens in other communities. If you're diagnosed with a disorder, they actually now have federal laws that protect you and say you get a little bit longer to take a test. By the way, you have a counselor evaluate. You don't have that in poorer communities. And you find out when you track all these kids all the way back that you could almost identify, just like Palantir has helped us do with you guys, who potential shooters are going to be and who are going to get shot, and they fall into that same framework. But what happens is sometimes school systems don't share information because of privacy matters. If kids get picked up and go into juvenile court, folks don't know about that either. And we have to really think through how we're going to identify them and put them on tracks that actually make a lot of sense. And I think we're struggling with this, and we don't know how to do it yet, but it is it's an absolutely good place to start.
So I would say priorities. We know that in America, before the age of 3rd or 4th grade, prison beds are being made for young people if they're not reading up to grade level. We also know that in America, $36,000 to $40,000 a year is spent on an inmate versus $6,000 to $7,000 on a child's education. So I think until we start really addressing the priorities in this country, we're going to continue to see young people who are not only pushed out of the education institutions, but also who are dropping out. In Philadelphia, at the same time that we had our education crisis of schools closing and a deficit, we had a $400 million prison that's being built up. So we as taxpayers, as individuals, as parents, as victims, as perpetrators, whatever, we have to constantly ask this question on what are the priorities in America and how can we redirect funds that benefit the people who most need them, which are young people.
I'm glad I'm not an elected official. Let me just start with that. But the reason I say that is because, you know, moving a crime rate in an election cycle, you're not going to see the payoff in a school investment. Is really in the short term, right? What you're doing in the investment is you're investing in the future. But it often doesn't get wrapped up into a crime rate discussion, for example, which is why public health often doesn't. Health resources, educational resources, everyone talks about it. When you say crime, oftentimes what happens is like, oh, you need more jobs, you need more education, which all of it is actually true. I would like to see, if I were an elected official, I would like to see this discussion happen in much this way, which is, all right, how do we frame this part of education as also being a public safety issue? How do we understand what skills we need to get young men and women so that in 20 years they do that? If you drop 500 jobs under the west side of Chicago today, none of the guys in the network would get those jobs, but that might go to somebody else who needs a job, and that might help their children. But that's a long term. It doesn't drive the rates down today. So I think it's a very complicated issue, and there are all these moving parts. But I think one way to think about that is framing about how it relates to public safety more broadly. And there are lots of ways to do that. We'd love to chat more about that.
Can I just ask the Mayor Rochester, since you're here, a question? I was just driving across much of upstate New York a couple of weeks ago, and you notice in several unhappy-looking towns, generally unhappy economically, you notice huge prisons, and if you study this for 5 minutes, that those prisons are warehousing people, mainly African American, from mainly 7 neighborhoods of New York City. And it just struck me, and I'm wondering if you could talk on this, if there are, if you believe that there are structural incentives in the way economies are organized to keep the system as is, because the money is being spent one way or the other on this population that you're talking about.
Correct.
Either it's going to warehouse them for the rest of their lives in these maximum security prisons, or it could be spent earlier in their lives. I just would love to hear your thoughts on that for a minute, because it really is striking that the biggest businesses in these small communities are often prisons that are taking care of people or holding people from hundreds of miles away.
It really is a controversy that's happening right now in New York State. 2 years ago, the New York State government combined the Division of Parole with the Department of Corrections. And so you have a number of people that are returning to our communities who are returning because the Department of Corrections don't want to pay for them anymore, but they're not giving them the resources to return effectively into the community. So I just had 2 14-year-old girls raped by a parolee. I've had an officer that was just killed in my city, first one in over 50 years, by a parolee. And so we have this issue with corrections, but it's all around economics, because the state wants to save money, and we go out and we say, hey, listen, come to New York, you can free taxes and everything else. But when you talk about public safety, people really don't want to deal with the true issues, and that's what's driving this. Is it education? Is it lack of economic opportunity? Or is it really about social issues and mental health? And so if we don't start to deal with the core, with the symptoms that's driving this, then we will not be able to change what's happening on our city streets.
Are there any other yes, ma'am. And we'll do one more question, and then I just want to wrap up from the...
I had a question regarding the criminalization of young people that do get caught and then forced into an adult system that actually seems to perpetuate the violence when they come out. how that's impacted cities, and if there's any kind of cutting-edge strategies on addressing that.
Well, ironically enough, I just came from a conference in New York called Growing Up Lockdown, which not only addresses the cultural issues with young people in communities that feel like they're already being incarcerated, either whether in their communities or in their schools, but also talking about the young people, unfortunately, who fall through the cracks and are arrested for petty crimes and unfortunately are placed into adult prisons. And we know, because the information shows us, that when you put young people into adult prisons, the likelihood of them coming back and not committing a more violent crime is higher. And so there's much talk, I think, locally and nationally about how do we redefine what the criminal justice system is doing to young people, and how can we create diversion programs. Just yesterday, my mayor announced a diversion program in partnership with the Department of Justice, which we're actually working with schools across Philadelphia to create diversion programs that will prevent young people from going directly to the court system and thinking about alternative ways to rehabilitate them or provide them resources that they need. So there are programs going on. It's not being scaled on a national basis, though.
Can we do this? I want to just go in this direction and just ask a general question. I have a specific one for you, though. The general question is, if you had a magic wand or unlimited budget, but to do one thing, what would that thing? I have a feeling I know what the ShotSpotter guy would say, but maybe there's something even more than this program. But I just want to hear, what is the most urgent policy fix you can come up with? Please answer that, but also I wanted to just ask you a very specific thing, going back to your presentation at the beginning. You show these dense social networks. So the simple question is, if you have a problem with forest fires, how do you stop forest fires from spreading through the entirety of the forest? You build fire roads. You build some paths through it where you're disconnecting the trees from each other. You look at a pattern like that and you say, what are the policy fixes that you could do to a social network to disrupt that network without taking every fourth person out of that and putting them in Angola for life?
Right. So it's actually really super hard to change networks. Let me start with that. What I would
without physically removing half of the network.
And you actually can't do it, which is why gangs in Chicago have been around for 60 years, which is why every time they take the head off the snake in Chicago, the gang is still there. I mean, they've changed quite a bit. The real answer is monitoring the behaviors in the fires and trying to get there as quickly as you can and potentially ahead of time. And I'm not even talking about pre-crime. But what I'm saying is, if it is an infectious disease, if it spreads, if violence spreads, if it's contagious, and not just in the sort of politically clever kind of way, there are things you can do, right? We have things like in other public health epidemics, needle exchange programs, right? And the idea is to start on the ground, to divert those resources to those who are at the most immediate risk. It doesn't fix the long-term solutions, doesn't fix schools, doesn't bring jobs, but it saves lives, right? And so part of the implication is we need to do one thing. You need to save lives. You need people to put down the gun. You could still be a jerk, right? You might not go to church, and that's okay with me as long as you don't shoot anybody. And then maybe we can work on those other things, right? But the most immediate thing is the risk to your life. Let's start there. Let's save your life, and then we can work on these other issues. So the implication there I see is focusing on those forest fires where they are. Not necessarily, I think the forest fire is not the right analogy. I think a spread of a disease is. If it were Ebola, we would be saturating it.
Well, it's the same in the sense that Ebola, you take the people who have Ebola, you quarantine them from the rest of the population until the disease dies out on its own accord.
Right, but those people inevitably die. Yeah. Right? I mean, that's the big difference here. Right. I'm assuming that this is treatable. I'm assuming that we can save those lives. In Ebola, essentially, that's not what we assume. Right. We hope we can get a vaccine someday, but we're not there. And so, in fact, what we're trying to do is limit the damage. I'm saying, let's be more proactive. Right.
Since you said I can only do one thing, if I had to choose one thing to do, I would think about long-term, which is investing in education for young people. We know that investing in education can prevent not only crime, we know that it can also enable a child to be able to reach their full potential. And so we talk about jobs and economic development a lot, but we know that a lot of people can't get jobs in can't succeed in economic development is because they're unemployable. And so how can you create resources where young people are giving the school the tools, transferable tools, and skills that they can take into any job market and be successful, that hopefully would help to enable the development of their community.
The reason I joined ShotSpotter is it's my personal belief that the issue of gun violence is the civil rights challenge of my generation. I believe until we have a national gunshot detection center that covers these at-risk areas in this country, and we make this data publicly available for everyone, from researchers to people working on the ground, to mayors who need to be held accountable, nothing will ever change. We've done that with the weather. We've got a drought system, and we could do it for half the cost of one F-22 Air Force jet.
Isn't that true?
Mayor?
Well, first of all, this is a solvable problem. I mean, lots of people used to smoke a long time ago. Now people don't smoke anymore. We can change behavioral patterns by doing a lot of things. So don't think that this is too complicated to solve. We can do it. The most essential thing for us in America is to accept what is true, that young African-American men's lives are really important. And they deserve to be protected as well. If we could get everybody just to think about that, that will move a lot of other stuff. In the interim, while we're trying to do that, and the reason why I say it's not just about guns, although it is because you have all of these other things that everybody here talked about. And sometimes when we just talk about guns, once you pass a gun law, everybody says, oh, we did that. Things are off the hook. But I would say, again, in the war that we're in, and he and I are in the emergency room. This is where we are. We're like emergency room physicians in the war zone. That's where we are. The thing you need to do is to stop the shooting. If you can just stop the shooting, we can talk about the other stuff. And we'll all go work on education, et cetera. But you gotta get to right now. Unfortunately, this is the most and the best thing, is stop the shooting. If we could do that right now, we would have time to breathe to get into the more difficult issues that I think are going to take a longer time, that are going to require the kind of investments that he's talking about.
Thank you very much. This is a great panel. I appreciate it
Great.
very much.
Thank you
very much for coming.
I guess our performance